day everyone! Welcome to another video lecture. And for today's lesson, we will discuss the period of colonization and revolution, Declaration of Independence. But before anything else, let's have an icebreaker. I will present a definition of a word, and all you have to do is to guess what word the definition I presented is referring to. I will give you 10 seconds to think and give the correct answer. Are you ready? Let's get started! Number 1. An overthrow or repudiation and the thorough replacement of an established government or political system by the people governed. Your 10 seconds starts now. The correct answer is revolution. Good job! Number 2. A condition of a person, nation, country, or state in which residents and population or some portion thereof exercise self-government and usually sovereignty over its territory. Your 10 seconds start now. The correct answer is independence. Number 3. The power or right to act, speak, or think as one, once without hindrance or restraint. Your 10 seconds starts now. The correct answer is freedom. Great job! Next, a large body of people united by common descent, history, culture, or language inhabiting a particular country or territory. Your 10 seconds starts now. The correct answer is nation. Good job! And lastly, a national legislative body, especially that of the U.S. Congress, which meets at the Capitol in Washington, D.C., was established by the Constitution of 1787 and is composed of the Senate and the House of Representatives. Your 10 seconds starts now. Time's up. And the correct answer is Congress. Good job, everyone! Those words that you just identified are related to the lesson that we will discuss today. So, I think you are now ready for our discussion. So, without further ado, let's get started! Here are the objectives for today's lesson. First, describe the American literature in line with the social and historical background of America during the period of colonization and revolution. Second, recognize the importance of war for independence as influence in American literature. And lastly, develop patriotism and love of country. Let us now discuss the period of colonization and revolution. The first one is the timeline of the American Revolution from 1763 to 1787. Here are the important events in the year 1763. The first one is in February 10, which is the signing of the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris ended the French and Indian War, the American phase of a worldwide 9 years war fought between France and Great Britain. The European phase was the 7 Years' War. As a result of the war, France ceded all of its North American possessions east of the Mississippi River to Britain. The cause of the war contributed to the British government's decision to impose new taxes on its American colonies. Next is in October 7, the Proclamation of 1763. The Proclamation Line of 1763 was a British-produced boundary mark in the Appalachian Mountains at the Eastern Continental Divide. Decreed on October 7, 1763, the Proclamation Line prohibited Anglo-American colonies from settling on lands acquired from the French following the French and Indian War. Let us now proceed to the year 1764. In April 5, the Sugar Act. Sugar Act, also called Plantation Act or Revenue Act in U.S. colonial history, British legislation aimed at ending the smuggling trade in sugar and molasses from the French and Dutch West Indies and at providing increased revenues to fund enlarged British Empire responsibilities following the French and Indian War. Actually, a reinvigoration of the largely ineffective Molasses Act of 1733, the Sugar Act provided for strong customs enforcement of the duties on refined sugars and molasses imported into the colonies from non-British Caribbean sources. Let us now move forward to year 1765. In March 22, the Stamp Act. Like the Sugar Act in 1764, the Stamp Act was imposed to provide increased revenues to meet the cost of defending the enlarged British Empire. It was the first British parliamentary attempt to raise revenue through direct taxation on a wide variety of colonial transactions, including legal rights, newspaper advertisements, and ships' bills of lading. Enlarged colonies nullified the Stamp Act through outright refusal to use the stamps as well as by riot, stamp burning, and intimidation of colonial stamp distributors. In May 15, the Quartering Act. Quartering Act in American colonial history, the British parliamentary provision requiring colonial authorities to provide food, drink, quarters, fuel, and transportation to British forces stationed in their towns or villages. Next is in May 30, the Virginian Resolution. The Virginian Assembly refused to comply with the Stamp Act. That letters be wrote to all our sister colonies acknowledging the receipt of the letters and results from Boston, informing them that before the same came to hand, the Virginia Assembly had been unexpectedly dissolved and most of the members returned to their respective countries. And in October 7 to 25, the Stamp Act Congress. Representatives from 9 of the 13 colonies declared the Stamp Act unconstitutional as it was a tax levied without their consent. The Stamp Act Congress passed a Declaration of Rights and Grievances which claimed that American colonies were equal to all other British citizens, protested taxation without representation, and stated that without colonial representation in Parliament, Parliament could not tax colonies. We will now jump to discuss the important events in the year 1766. In March 18, the Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act passed by Parliament on the same day the Stamp Act was repealed stated that Parliament could make laws binding the American colonies in all cases whatsoever. And now we will discuss the important events happened in the year 1767. In June 29, Townshend Revenue Act. Parliament passed the Townshend Acts on June 29, 1767. They include the Townshend Revenue Act, which is excerpted later, an act setting up a new Board of Customs Commissioners, and an act suspending New York's law-making body, the New York Assembly. Now, we will move forward to the year 1768. In October 1, British troops arrived in Boston in response to political unrest. British troops land in Boston to maintain Order 1768. The actions of the colonies in response to the Townshend Act convinced the British that they needed troops in Boston to help maintain order. Lord Hillsborough, Secretary of State for the colonies, dispatched 2 regiments to restore order in Boston. We will now discuss the important events happened in the year 1770. In March 5, the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre was a deadly riot that occurred on March 5, 1770 on King Street in Boston. It began as a street brawl between American colonies and a lone British soldier, but quickly escalated to a chaotic bloody slaughter. Next is in April 12, the repeal of the Townshend Revenue Act. On April 12, 1770, the British government moves to mollify outraged colonies by repealing most of the clauses of the hated Townshend Act. Townshend's Annual Revenue Act levied a controversial package of taxes on the colonies, including duties on lead, painters, colors, paper, and tea. Hear what happened in the year 1772. In June 10, burning of the Gaspee. William Duddingston were sent by King George III to Rhode Island waters in March of 1772 to enforce the maritime trade laws and prevent smuggling. Near daylight on June 10, the Rhode Islanders set fire to the Gaspee, burning her to the waterline, whereupon her powder magazine exploded. And now we will jump to the year 1773. Publication of Thomas Hutchinson letter. The letters were finally published in the Boston Gazette in mid-June 1773, causing a political firestorm in Massachusetts and raising significant questions in England. In these letters, Hutchinson explained the revolts in the colony against taxes and recommended that colonial government should be made independent from provincial assemblies and the gradual reduction by degrees of English liberties. In May 10, the Tea Act. In an effort to save the troubled enterprise, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act in 1773. The act granted the company the right to ship its tea directly to the colonies without first landing it in England, and to commission agents who would have the sole right to sell tea in the colonies. Next, we have the Boston Tea Party in December 16. Boston Tea Party incident in which 342 chests of tea belonging to the British East India Company were thrown from ships into Boston Harbor by American patriots disguised as Mohawks Indians. Let us now move forward to discuss the important events happened in 1774. May to June, the Intolerable Acts. The coercive acts, which were called the Intolerable Acts by the American colonies, were passed by Parliament in 1774 in response to colonial resistance to British rule. The four acts were: first, the Boston Port Bill, which closed Boston Harbor; second, the Massachusetts Government Act, which replaced the elective local government with an appointive one and increased the powers of the military governor; third, the Administration of Justice Act, which allowed British officials charged with capital offenses to be tried in another colony or in England; and fourth, the Quartering Act, which permitted the requisition of unoccupied buildings to house British troops. And we have in September the Continental Congress. On September 5, 1774, delegates from each of the 13 colonies except from Georgia, which was fighting a Native American uprising and was dependent on the British for military supplies, met in Philadelphia as the first Continental Congress to organize colonial resistance to Parliament's coercive acts. And now we will move forward to the year 1775. In April 19, battles of Lexington and Concord. On April 19, 1775, British and American soldiers exchanged fire in the Massachusetts town of Lexington and Concord. At the North Bridge in Concord, the British were confronted again, this time by 300 to 400 armed colonists, and were forced to march back to Boston with the Americans firing on them all the way. Next, we have in June 16, Continental Congress appoints George Washington Commander-in-Chief of Continental Army. The Continental Congress commissioned George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Washington was selected over other candidates such as John Hancock based on his previous military experience and the hope that a leader from Virginia could help unite the colonies. Next, we have in June 17, Battle of Bunker Hill. The American patriots were defeated at the Battle of Bunker Hill, but they proved that they could hold their own against the superior British army. The fierce fight confirmed that any reconciliation between England and American colonies was no longer possible. And in July 5, the Olive Branch Petition. The Olive Branch Petition was adopted by Congress on July 5, 1775 to be sent to the king as a last attempt to prevent formal war from being declared. The petition emphasized their loyalty to the British Crown and emphasized their rights as British citizens. The Congress met according to adjournment. Let us now move forward in the year 1775 to 1776. Winter Invasion of Canada by Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold commanded provincial troops sent against Quebec through the wilderness of Canada. Patriot forces under Colonel Arnold and General Richard Montgomery attempted to capture the British-occupied city of Quebec and prompt the province of Quebec to join the rebellion against the British. Now we will discuss the important events happened in the year 1776. In January 9, Thomas Paine's Common Sense published anonymously in Philadelphia. On January 9, 1776, writer Thomas Paine publishes his pamphlet Common Sense, setting forth his arguments in favor of American independence. Although little used today, pamphlets were an important medium for the spread of ideas in the 16th through 19th centuries. Originally published anonymously, Common Sense advocated independence for the American colonies from Britain and is considered one of the most influential pamphlets in American history. Credited with uniting average citizens and political leaders behind the idea of independence, Common Sense played a remarkable role in transforming a colonial squabble into the American Revolution. Next, in May 2, France provides covert aid to the Americans. The primary ally of the American colonies was France. At the start of the war, France helped by providing supplies to the Continental Army such as gunpowder, cannons, clothing, and shoes. In 1778, France became an officially ally of the United States through the Treaty of Alliances. In July 4, Continental Congress issues the Declaration of Independence. By issuing the Declaration of Independence, adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4, 1776, the 13 American colonies severed their political connections to Great Britain. The Declaration summarized the colonies' motivation for seeking independence. Next, we have battles of Long Island and White Plains. British forces occupy New York after American defeats. On August 27, successfully moved against the American Continental Army led by George Washington. The battle was part of a British campaign to seize control of New York and thereby isolate New England from the rest of the colonies. In 1776, the British Army. In December 26, Battle of Trenton, New Jersey, providing a boost to American morale. The Battle of Trenton was a small but pivotal American Revolutionary War battle that took place on the morning of December 26, 1776 in Trenton, New Jersey. The battle significantly boosted the Continental Army's waning morale and inspired re-enlistments. New enlistments were stimulated and many of the current soldiers re-enlisted. This turn of events enabled Washington to execute another daring move, the attack on Princeton on January 3. Now we will move forward in the year 1777. In January 2 to 3, the Battle of Princeton in New Jersey. The American victory of the Battle of Princeton was one of the most consequential of the American Revolution. George Washington and his soldiers marched north from Trenton and attacked a British force south of the town. Next, we have in October 13, British surrender of 5,700 troops at Saratoga. The Battle of Saratoga was a turning point in the Revolutionary War. The American defeat of the superior British Army lifted patriot morale, furthered the hope for independence, and helped to secure the foreign support needed to win the war. Next is in the year 1778. In February 6, France recognizes U.S. independence. On February 6, 1778, France and the fledgling United States of America signed the Treaty of Amity and Commerce and the Treaty of Alliance in Paris, France. The Treaty of Amity and Commerce recognized the United States as an independent nation and promoted trade between France and the United States. And now we will jump to discuss the important events happened in the year 1780. In August 16, U.S. defeat at Battle of Camden. The Battle of Camden in South Carolina was a lopsided victory for the British during the American Revolutionary War. Despite the proliferation of dysentery among his men, Continental General Horatio Gates chose to engage British General Charles Cornwallis force on the morning of August 16, 1780. And now, we will jump in the year 1781. In March 1, ratification of the Articles of Confederation. On March 1, 1781, the Articles of Confederation are finally ratified. The articles were signed by Congress and sent to the individual states for ratification on November 15, 1777. After 16 months of debate, bickering over land claims between Virginia and Maryland delayed final ratification for almost 4 more years. Next, in September 5, Battle of the Capes, denying British reinforcement or evacuation. The Battle of the Capes only lasted 2.5 hours and did not involve any Americans. But this battle was one of the decisive factors that assured the United States would win independence from Great Britain. And in October 18, surrender of British forces under Cornwallis at Yorktown. On October 18, 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis surrendered his army of some 8,000 men to General George Washington at Yorktown, giving up any chance of winning the Revolutionary War. Hours after the surrender, the general's defeated troops marched out of Yorktown to the tune "The World Turned Upside Down." And now we will move forward in the year 1782. In March 5, British government authorizes peace negotiations. On March 5, 1782, 12 years after the Boston Massacre, Britain entered into peace negotiations with the French and Americans. In the resulting Peace of Paris in 1783, Britain recognized U.S. independence and agreed to cease hostilities and withdraw troops. Now we will jump in the year 1783. In September 3, Treaty of Paris formally ending the Revolutionary War. The Treaty of Paris was signed by U.S. and British representatives on September 3, 1783, ending the War of the American Revolution. The 1783 treaty was one of a series of treaties signed at Paris in 1783 that also established peace between Great Britain and the allied nations of France, Spain, and the Netherlands. And now we will discuss the important events happened in the year 1786 to 1787. And lastly, 1787. In May 25, Constitutional Convention. A convention of delegates from all the states except Rhode Island met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in May of 1787. Known as the Constitutional Convention, at this meeting it was decided that The best solution to the young country's problem was to set aside the Articles of Confederation and write a new constitution. And on June 21, 1788, the Constitution became the official framework of the government of the United States of America, when New Hampshire became the ninth of the 13 states to ratify it. The journey to ratification, however, was a long and arduous process. And here are the references used for this video lecture. And that will be the end of the part 1 of our discussion about the period of colonization and revolution, Declaration of Independence. I hope you learned a lot from today's lesson. See you in the second part of our discussion. Thank you for watching!